reinstatement of our new government, with Labour now in charge of the country and their plans to scrap Section 21 immediately, what is going to happen to the private rental sector? So today we're just going to be doing a bit of a dive into the potentially damaging consequences of abolishing the no-fault eviction for both tenants and landlords. So there's going to be kind of bad fallouts from both sides of the fence. Now, as we know, the Conservatives brought onto the table the abolishment of Section 21. They then stepped back and kind of retracted that slightly and said, look, we are going to do it, but until we have a court system that's been reformed and fit for purpose, we're going to put that on ice for the time being. Labour is saying, actually, no, there's going to be no review of the court process. We're just going to go straight in and abolish Section 21. Now, having through and through a tenant eviction myself, where I used both a Section 8 because the tenant was massively in rent arrears, and also leaning on a Section 21 as a backup. I've been through this process firsthand, so I do come to the table with some real knowledge of how the whole thing works. And what I can say is that while I could have evicted my tenant on the grounds of Section 8 with the no rental payments, because there's kind of various clauses in terms of what's eligible for Section 8 evictions, actually we ended up leaning on the Section 21 instead, and that was really what saved my bacon, because having had a tenant not paying rent for over a year, I simply couldn't afford to carry on. So if things had been allowed to kind of continue on the same vein, with my tenant doing things like going into breathing space, making very small payments, so they were no longer fully in arrears, which meant that the kind of process had to almost start again. You know, I think I would have actually ended up in real problems. So from my perspective, I see the abolishment of Section 21 with no kind of backup in terms of reforming the court system as a really bad thing. But actually what we're going to do today is just go into look at a bit more detail about the various fallouts of these in terms of how this can impact you and also tenants, because let's not forget this is meant to be protecting tenants. The whole premise of abolishing Section 21 is to be looking after tenants, but actually there's going to be negative impacts, and probably the most negative impacts on these guys, unfortunately. Okay, so let's talk about court reforms for a moment. So if you are to serve a Section 21 on your tenant, assuming they simply then ultimately vacate the property in the appropriate time frame, there is no need to take the process to a court. That doesn't involve the courts at all. The only time that you kind of end up having to progress things to the courts is if the tenant doesn't vacate the property on the back of the Section 21 kind of coming to an end. So actually Section 21 can largely avoid going via the courts, whereas when you use Section 8, which is where you're using grounds for repossession, in my case it was rent arrears, actually this has to go through a court process. Now, to give you a guideline, when I was pursuing my tenant for non-payment of rents and looking to repossess the property or evict the tenants, the court process was the thing that actually took so long. So you would apply to the court for a hearing. The court date would be months in the future, so literally months. Actually, once eventually, my tenants actually went to court on a Section 21 notice with Section 8 as a backup. And then we had to go through the fact they then didn't move out at the end of that notice period from the courts, and then we had to effect a bailiff as well. So in between each of these kind of stages, of which there were kind of three, which involved referring back to the legal system, the whole thing took me the best part of 9 months, which in terms of lost rent equated to around £15,000. So like I say, you know, from my perspective, that was almost a kind of sink or swim situation for me, and thankfully I managed to get out of it just in time, which was very fortunate. Not everyone's going to be so lucky. So I think realistically the key thing is for landlords is that Labour have no plans at the moment to bring in any reforms of the court. So what this means is that if there's no Section 21, people are going to have to lean on Section 8, which means going from a court process. The courts are really busy anyway, and we're just going to see more and more cases backing up in the courtrooms, which is just going to make life extremely uncomfortable, both from a court process perspective and also for landlords. So in terms of how this is going to look in terms of landlord behaviours going forwards, the abolishment of Section 21 will first of all mean that landlords are going to be far more vigorous in terms of vetting their tenants. They're going to become super selective, and as we know, it is hyper competitive in the rental market anyway. So for every property that goes on the market to rent, there's a huge number of people that are looking to take it on. So landlords are essentially going to be looking for the cream of the crop in terms of tenants. So things they could be looking at which would impact the decision: the combined income of tenants, employment history, credit rating most definitely. So for those tenants who You know, landlords might have kind of forgiven a credit blip in the past. That's not going to be the case. If the tenants have pets, most landlords don't want pets in their properties. So actually, if you're a tenant without a pet, also with a pet, you're going to be distinctly disadvantaged. They're going to be looking at whether tenants receive benefits, and more on that in a moment. And also if there's this previous Section 8 notice on their record as well. So essentially landlords are going to be putting themselves in a situation where they're thinking, well, okay, if I'm going to have to go through a court process, which is going to take months and months to evict a tenant, then actually I'm going to make sure that the odds of my tenant being a problem are reduced as much as they possibly can. And therefore hyper-selective tenant vetting process is going to come into play, which means that those tenants who have pets, have lower incomes, may have the odd credit blip on their file, may find that actually they find it incredibly hard to actually find somewhere to rent at all. Now, another fallout which is going to impact tenants adversely, those people that this abolishment of Section 21 is there to protect, is the unintentional consequence, one would hope, of potentially tenants being rendered intentionally homeless. Now, essentially what this means is that when applying for council accommodation, if a tenant has made themselves intentionally homeless, then the council can refuse to provide them in accommodation, which means that the person could end up actually genuinely homeless, which is absolutely awful. Now, things which can be looked at. So first of all, by being served a Section 8 notice, that's certainly going to make the housing associations take note and try and have a look at what's been going on in terms of the behaviours of their prospective tenant. So things like whether the tenant has had antisocial behaviour, whether they refuse to take benefits to help pay their rents, and also refusal to pay rents when they had the means to do so, could mean that actually a person is classed as making themselves intentionally homeless. Now, whereas with a Section 21, if someone hadn't paid their rent and a landlord simply opted to use a Section 21 to evict them, this wouldn't come up. Now, obviously, landlords are going to have to use a Section 8 notice, which means that essentially this is always going to come up and cases are going to be looked at more closely. So we do believe that one of the things that could really happen is that it's going to leave more people genuinely homeless going forwards. So really, just to summarise, the kind of consequences of abolishing Section 21 could mean that the court systems become even more busy than they already are and could potentially face collapse. We could see landlords becoming hyper selective in terms of which tenants they choose to take on, which could mean that actually some people simply cannot find a property in which to live, and that could cause homelessness. Equally, they could see that the number of rental properties as landlords look to leave the market because they're disenfranchised, more so than they already are, would mean a reduction in rental stock further than there has been, which could increase the amount of rents that landlords can charge because of the supply and demand issue, which we're obviously very aware of. It also means that by using a Section 8 to evict a tenant, this could cause unintentional homelessness from the tenant's perspective when applying for council property. And then lastly, one more thing just to note in terms of what Labour is talking about doing is bidding wars. So essentially what they're saying, this is slightly separate to Section 21, but just worth commenting on, is that Labour's plans are that they're going to control the bidding on buy-to-let properties or rental properties. Now, what this I think would look like is that essentially people would be able to put an offer in to rent a property, and then the landlord would simply choose. And all this means is the landlord's just going to go for the highest offer on the property, a bit like if you're selling your home. And of course, landlords are obviously taking into account the tenant's kind of profile, but if you have two very similar tenants but one's offering you more rent than the other, this means you're simply going to go with the highest one, because why wouldn't you? Ultimately, that would make perfect sense. So what this is going to do is essentially drive up bids for rental properties, which means that actually people are going to go in with higher offers straight away to try and secure properties in this fiercely competitive market, which is just going to drive up rents even further. So essentially what this means is that the tenant ultimately again pays the price, because the rental incomes or the rental figures offered are going to increase to secure properties, which means they simply come off worse. Now, having said all of this, it sounds like we're incredibly down on the abolishment of Section 21, and I think it's fair to say that we certainly don't see it as a positive move. However, we do understand the sentiment of looking to protect tenants, and obviously that is to be afforded. I think what's being kind of neglected to be noted is that actually the vast majority of landlords are good landlords providing good quality housing stock. They want their tenants to stay in place. No landlord likes losing a good tenant. People aren't kind of randomly evicting tenants just for the sort of fun of things. So I think actually, the reality is that most landlords are, running really, really good businesses, and that's not who this is designed to kind of impact. Really, where the government are kind of heading is looking to remove the behaviours of rogue landlords, of which there are just very, very few. So protecting tenants, yes, we're all for that. Absolutely supporting good landlords, we're all for that as well. But actually what it feels like to us at the moment is that the abolishment of Section 21 and also the ending of bidding wars is really not going to have the desired impact. Actually, ultimately, it's going to be detrimental for tenants at the very end of things, which is really not what anybody wants. So we do think that actually Labour needs to go back, relook at what they're suggesting, relook at the court process as an absolute minimum, and come back to the table with something which is going to be beneficial for those people they're looking to protect, i.e. the tenants.